So, Lone Rider here, and I want to talk about rapiers. Now, there's a general misperception among people, some people anyway, that this is a light sword. And the fact is, it's not really. This weighs about as much as a medieval arming sword. Uh, Basically, you have the same amount of metal in the blade, it's just in a different shape. It's longer and thinner. But it's not much less mass in the blade. And then you have this big hilt with these bars and these guards and all of that there. So there's about as much metal in this as you would have in let's say a medieval sword. Uh, so why is there a perception that, unlike let's say an arming sword, this is a light, dainty sword? Well, I think for a lot of people, what they're confusing this with is what came afterwards, which is the small sword. Something like this. This is a blunt practice one. But small swords, you can see there's not as much metal in the hilt. The blade is a lot thinner, narrower, really can only thrust, whereas this is a cut and thrust sword. It's just optimized for the thrust. Some of these don't weigh much more than fencing foil, which at the time was the practice weapon for it. And in a way, this did take the place of the rapier as a civilian sidearm in history. So maybe it's understandable that some people who don't know much about swords might confuse this for the small sword. But if you look at them, you can see they're very different, right? Look at the blades, look at the hilt. The blade on the rapier is a lot longer. It's a lot wider. It has this big beefy ricasso. There's a lot more metal in the hilt and the guard on the rapier. It's just a bigger, heavier sword. But if people are in fact confusing rapiers for small swords or even fencing foils, it might explain why they think they're really lightweight. The second possible source for this myth is that they don't hit as hard, right? Especially compared to medieval swords tend to be the bread and butter of HEMA, historical swordsmanship. Longsword tends to be the most popular, and single-handed medieval swords like arming sword and buckler, messer, tend to be a close second. Well, those swords have a lot more mass in the hitty part, or what we would call center of percussion of the blade. Why? Well, the blades are wider, and so on and so forth. They're going to hit harder, right? So if you're on the receiving end of a blow from a rapier, it's not going to hit as hard. You're going to therefore think, well, it's lighter. It may be lighter in terms of the amount of mass there is in the part of the blade that you're getting hit with. But overall, as a sword, especially for the person using it, as distinguished from you being on the receiving end, yes, it may not hit as hard, but the overall weight is about the same as a medieval arming sword. So you almost have to distinguish between the force with which it hits, or the amount of weight that appears to be in the blade, and the overall weight of the sword to the person who's using it, manipulating it, fighting with it. And then you have something else to consider, which is weight doesn't really tell the whole story. Most medieval swords, they tend to have retracted guard positions. The swords are held back or down low, primarily because they usually only have a cross guard. They don't have a great deal of hand protection. If you are going to hold a medieval sword out like this, you do one of two things. You either hold it in long point, where you're directly threatening the opponent with the blade, with the tip of the point in the blade, so that they can approach you to snipe at your hand or your arm. Or you use it with a small shield, with a buckler, to guard your sword hand. If you're just using the sword by itself and you're not in long point, generally speaking, all the guard positions are going to be with the sword held back or down low, close to your body. Now, contrast that with something like this. A sword that has a complex hilt, whether it's the bars and swept hilt and basket of a rapier, whether it's the shell and knuckle guard of a small sword, or whether it's in fact the knuckle bow of a saber, a sword that has a complex hilt is typically held further away from the body, often at arm's length, right? With a saber, you'll get guards like this, and with a rapier, the sword is typically held out at arm's length. Now, this is where you kind of get a problem with the idea of just looking at the weight, right? Even if this weighs about the same as an arming sword, okay, it's a lot heavier than some people think it is. It's definitely not as light as a small sword or a foil, but that doesn't even tell the whole story, because when you're holding the sword out at arm's length, a leverage effect comes into play, and the sword, because all that weight is further away from you, it's actually more tiring on your arm to use, and consequently on all the rest of you, which has to support the structure of your arm. So yes, it weighs about as much as other one-handed swords or more, but that even doesn't tell the whole story. It's actually more tiring to use one of these because it's held out at arm's length. So not only is it not a light sword, it actually can feel heavier than it is, especially if you're not used to using a one-handed sword of this weight. So there's that, and for comparison purposes, a proper chopping sword, like a saber, and this of course is a practice one that I did sharpen it to do test cutting with, but it's a practice one with a very narrow blade. A real saber would have a much wider blade, but nevertheless, for comparison purposes, you can look at them, and I can hold them, and this saber is nowhere near as heavy as this rapier is. It's just not, right? There's not as much mass in the hilt or the blade, and frankly, the blade is shorter. So, even what mass there is closer into your body. And yes, you're going to hold a saber is going to be held at arm's length. But it's usually not going to be held straight out like the way you'd hold the rapier. It's usually going to be held at some kind of an angle or closer in to some degree. So, you can't even compare that. This is a good proper chopper, as someone might say, but the slim, slender, so-called lightweight rapier is actually heavier and way more massive. And so I really don't know where this misperception came from. Those are a few ideas I have about the subject, though. But, let's be realistic about what these are. These are big, beefy, cut-and thrust swords. They just happen to be optimized for the thrust. But they're not lightweight. They're not flimsy. They're pretty substantial things. So there you go. A little bit about the rapier, and of course rapiers are not light. I really don't know where this comes from, but yeah, this is hopefully this will help correct that misconception. And there you go. Lone Rider out.